Hi, everybody. In order to understand the origins of Buddhism, you need to have a picture of the world of the person who would become the Buddha. The person whose given name was Gautama. This is the world of India in the 5th century BCE. You need to know a bit about the physical geography of India, and you need to know more about the culture and religious outlook of the time. That's why we have this two-part lecturette called Gautama's World. And in this one, we're going to be talking about the physical geography of India in the 5th century BCE, and in part B, about the religious geography. Now on this slide, that little image you see is some houses on the outskirts of Lumbini. It's a small town in Nepal, and it happens to be where the Buddha was born. Notice the terraced hillsides. Imagine that those terraces were just starting to be developed for residences and for agriculture about the time that the Buddha was born. On this slide, you'll find a physical map of India, which can also be found in your online map gallery. But it's useful to look at the map in the trainer book on page 13, which we've talked about before, because it gives more details of the central part, which is India. On this map, I've also added the names of the modern-day nation-states, but I'm just putting them there to help you get oriented, and of course those names did not exist in ancient times. This region of South Asia, this entire region is called South Asia, was divided into various shifting kingdoms of different sizes at different periods of history. Notice that India is basically a diamond-shaped landmass, with the bottom sides of the diamond being the coastlines of the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, and the top sides being the mountain ranges between present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan on the west and the Himalayan ranges on the east, the Himalayan ranges that separate India and Nepal from the Tibetan Plateau and China. Now, India is sometimes referred to as a subcontinent. And sometimes people think it's because it's like a subpar continent. It's not quite a continent. But that's not the reason why it's called a subcontinent. It's called a subcontinent because it hangs down underneath the landmass of Eurasia. So it literally means under a continent. The other thing you should know is that when I use the term India, I don't mean just the modern nation state of India, but the historically larger area of Indian culture, which includes present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. The term that's used to describe this entire area is South Asia. Now, notice that I'm not saying Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia refers to Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, all those places. This is South Asia. The trainer map shows some of the mountains as well, but for a better view, look at the South Asia map on this slide. You'll see that in addition to the top bordering mountains, there's also mountains on the southwest coast called the Western Ghats, and mountains on the southeast coast called the Eastern Ghats. And very importantly, there's also a range of mountains across the midsection of the Indian subcontinent, and those mountains in the middle are called the Vindhyas. You'll see Vindhya Range right above the word India on the map. So, about 70 million years ago, a piece of the African landmass broke away and started drifting towards Eurasia. Obviously, this signaled a deep movement underneath the Earth's plates, which expressed itself eventually in reforming the major land masses. This shifting of the Earth's plates is called plate tectonics, and maybe you've studied it in a geology class or in history class or geography class. And so, about 10 million years ago, this drifting plate smashed against Eurasia and formed what we now know as South Asia. It buckled at the top and the bottom and the middle, and that's how those mountain ranges were formed. These mountain ranges are important not only geographically and in terms of climate, but also because they form cultural barriers of different degrees. On the one hand, they keep other people out, but they also formed barriers which allowed the cultures inside the mountain ranges to develop in unique ways. This is especially true of the ranges on the northeast, the Himalayas. They made contact with Tibet and China somewhat difficult, but not impossible. Now, on the west, India could be entered via the passes in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan. You see where it says Hindu Kush in there? And foreign invaders periodically did so, infusing India with cultural patterns from the West. You might know that Alexander the Great made it almost to India. His successors, the successors of Alexander, created a Greek-inspired culture that got established in an area called Bactria, which is present-day Afghanistan. That culture was very important in the early development of Buddhism, so we'll come back to that in a couple of weeks. Notice the Vindhya range in the middle of the map, just above the word India. Those are kind of low mountains, sort of like the Appalachians. And they created a mild cultural barrier between North India and South India. And so the ways of living in the North India and the ways of living in South India are rather different. Most of the great rivers originate in the top mountains and they flow to the sea. But they don't really flow from north to south. They sort of flow from northeast to southwest. And in some places they really flow almost directly west to east. They provided a way for people to travel across the northern part of the subcontinent. And this is really important because in ancient times, that entire plain of North India, north of the Vindhyas, was thickly forested, densely forested. Today it's rather deforested, but in ancient times it was so heavily forested that the movement of peoples from west to east had to take place along the rivers. This happened before roads were built. The major fact of life in the climate of South Asia is the monsoon. Now, the monsoon is an intense rain pattern that forms in the Indian Ocean in early spring and travels across Asia during the summer. There's another monsoon in the fall, but that one's not quite so important for us. If you're in any of the major cities on the west coast of India in early June, such as Mumbai, you can look out at the ocean and see the monsoon. It's a huge black cloud that fills the horizon, and it's traveling every day getting closer to India. And when it reaches the subcontinent, a great deal of its rain is deposited right along the west coast because it runs into those coastal mountains I talked about, the Western Ghats. For the 3 months of the monsoon, the interior of India, on the other side of the Western Ghats, gets a few hours of rain every day, but it's enough to build an entire agricultural economy. When the monsoon fails, as it does some years, there's trouble for small farmers. In ancient times, and even during the 400 years when the British ruled India, there could be mass starvation and deprivation before large-scale storage and distribution of agricultural products was implemented. Now, the monsoon has had a great impact on Indian culture. There's a lot of poetry and visual art dealing with the monsoon. The dark evening skies allow for lovers to meet. The monsoon's impact on the development of early Buddhism is also huge. During the rest of the year, the early Buddhist communities of monks, by choice, did not have a permanent place to live. They wandered and they lived on alms that they were given, and they did this deliberately. And we're going to talk about why the Buddha set up this particular pattern of living. In any case, during the monsoon, the monks could not wander around. They had to make a spiritual retreat. So, wealthy merchants and aristocrats made pavilions. They paid for pavilions and other structures for the monks to stay in during the rainy season. And instead of the monks going from house to house to beg for alms to live on, the lay people came to them during the rainy season. And this created new kinds of bonds between monks and lay people. The monks also used this period of stability, when they weren't wandering around, to develop Buddhist literature and Buddhist scripture, and to solidify their distinct way of living. So you can see these three major things happened during the rainy season that forever changed the course of Buddhism. New relationships with patrons, new relationships with lay people, and a kind of stability to allow for the development of Buddhist culture. Now that we have an idea about Indian geography and climate, we can focus on how this geography figured into the culture of the Buddha's time. And so, in a way, this slide, although it's about geography, is also a transition to our next section, the world, Gautama's world, part B, which is about culture and history. So, during the period that we're talking about, India, south of the Vindhyas, see the Vindhyas there in the middle of the map, the mountain range, was populated, and it had its own indigenous culture, but it wasn't part of the cultural world to which the future Buddha belonged. People north of the Vindhyas did not know the world south of the Vindhyas very well. It was mysterious and foreign to them. So we're going to be focusing on this area north of the Vindhyas for now. During this period, we can think, it's a little bit oversimplified, but we can think of two cultural and religious poles, or centers of activity, during the time of the Buddha. So if you look at the west side of the map, you'll see the Indus River there. When migrants and other visitors came from the west, they referred to the land on the other side of the Indus River as India. That's how India got its name. And it's a little bit hard to see on this map, but if you look up as the Indus River goes inland, you'll see it divides into 5 rivers. Um, and these 5 rivers or 5 waters translate into Punjab. And that's how the region that we call Punjab today got its name. Punjab is sort of divided between part of it's in India and part of it's in Pakistan. About 2,000 years before the Buddha was born, this Indus Valley area was the center of a great urban civilization, similar to the ancient cities along the Nile or the cities along the Tigris and the Euphrates. But that civilization was already in decline when the next group of peoples arrived in India. These people were the Aryans. Now, Arya means noble ones, and they belong to a much larger group of people called Indo-Europeans. And these Indo-Europeans were nomadic people who became the ancestors not only of the Aryans in India, but of the peoples of Europe, because some of them traveled west, and the peoples of Iran, which was pretty close to where they started out. We can tell this from linguistic and archaeological evidence. One example of this is that the westernmost outpost of these peoples was called Eire, or Ireland, which is related to the word Aryan. And the name of Iran is also related to the word Arya. So if you happen to be Irish, you actually have a very distant relationship to these people who migrated into India about 2000, 1700 BCE. Now, it's important to note that this word Aryan is a linguistic group. I'm going to repeat this a couple of times because it's confusing to some people. The Nazis misunderstood this term, and they applied it to a certain physical type of European. In other words, they applied it to white people, blonde people, blue-eyed people. And then later, white supremacists took up this word and the Nazi ideology that went with it. But when the term is used by historians and linguists and by the peoples of ancient India, it didn't have that meaning and it doesn't have that meaning. The point here is that in ancient India, the area of the 5 rivers might be called the Old Aryan Homeland. The original region of the settlement of the Aryans where they first entered India. And you can see that area of the map is marked by an orange circle on the left side, the west side of the map. At the same time, Gautama was born. This region was still a center of orthodoxy of the ancient Vedic sacrificial religion. But it was becoming less important politically and economically than the region where the Buddha was born, which is the orange circle on the right side of the map, the east side of the map. These regions were newer. Now, let's look at this a little bit more closely. On that map on page 13 of Trainer that I keep referring you to, you'll see comparatively few cities in the upper left or west region. As you move across the central plain, the cities begin to increase. The cities tend to be near the rivers, including the Ganges, because, as I said, the rivers were the principal route by which the eastward migration of people occur. Gautama himself was born in a small town in the foothills of Himalayas called Lumbini, as we said. Even though the stories of the Buddha's life represent this town as a princely state, since Gautama was, of course, a prince. The eastern cities represented by the red dots in the trainer map are all associated with the life of the Buddha and the community of monks that he established. These are places like Shravasti, Vaishali, Pataliputra, and Rajagriha. In the texts of the Pali Canon, which is the first collection of the early Buddhist scriptures, we read the names of these towns over and over again. And so, even though these towns are not marked on the map on the slide, you can see them on Trainer, but they're roughly in the area where the orange circle is on the right of the map. Now, in the old Aryan homeland on the west, where the original settlement of Aryans in India was, and the region up to about present-day Delhi, you see New Delhi in the middle of the map, people were organized around confederacies of clans. In the more eastern areas, where the Buddha was born, a new form of social organization that's been called quote-unquote city republics was becoming the new norm. These were a kind of quasi-hereditary kingship with representation from various powerful factions. The term city republics might sound like something more like a Greek democracy, so it's important to keep in mind that it was still a kind of a monarchy. Gautama himself was born a prince in such a royal city republic on the eastern side of India, a newer world with newer social, newer economic, and newer religious and philosophical possibilities than were occurring in the old Aryan homeland. Not only was the form of government different in the newer eastern areas, the social and religious outlook actually challenged the religion and the social structure established in the Aryan way of life. And we're going to take this up in part B of Gautama's world.